It was just past midnight in the dimly lit warehouse, the hum of machinery barely masking the exhaustion of the workers. The CEO, disguised in a worn-out uniform and a cap pulled low over his face, moved quietly through the aisles. He had been working there for 3 days, blending in as a new hire, trying to understand the realities of his own company. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. As he turned the corner near the break room, he froze. A middle-aged man, his face etched with fatigue, was crouched near a trash bin. The man glanced around nervously before pulling out a half-eaten sandwich from the garbage. He wiped it quickly with his sleeve and took a bite, his hands trembling. The CEO's heart sank. He felt a lump in his throat as he watched the man, who was clearly struggling, trying to hide his actions from the others. The CEO stepped back, his mind racing. This was one of his employees, someone who worked long hours in his warehouse, someone who helped build the success of his company. And yet, here he was, reduced to scavenging for food. The CEO felt a wave of guilt and anger, guilt for not knowing, and anger at a system that allowed this to happen. He knew then that this undercover mission was no longer just about understanding his business, it was about uncovering the truth and making things right. But how could he, a man who had always focused on profits and growth, begin to address such a deep-rooted issue? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain, his life, and the lives of his employees, were about to change forever. The CEO sat in his car outside the warehouse, staring at the steering wheel. His hands were still shaking from what he had just witnessed. He had built this company from the ground up, starting with a small team and a dream. Over the years, it had grown into a massive success, with warehouses across the country and millions in revenue. But now, for the first time, he felt a deep unease about the cost of that success. He had heard rumors before, whispers about low wages, long hours, and unhappy workers. But he had always brushed them off, assuming they were exaggerated or isolated incidents. After all, he had policies in place, didn't he? Benefits, safety measures, and a HR department to handle complaints. But seeing that man in the break room, sneaking food from the trash, shattered that illusion. It wasn't just a rumor, it was real, and it was happening under his nose. The CEO made a decision. He couldn't go back to his corner office and pretend he hadn't seen what he saw. He needed to understand the full picture, to see the world through the eyes of his employees. That's why he had gone undercover in the first place. But now, it wasn't just about curiosity, it was about responsibility. The next morning, he arrived at the warehouse early, still in his disguise. He signed in as a temporary worker, using the fake name he had created for this mission. The supervisor, a gruff man with a clipboard, barely glanced at him as he assigned him to the loading dock. The CEO nodded, keeping his head down, and joined the other workers. The work was grueling. He lifted heavy boxes, stacked pallets, and moved inventory for hours on end. His muscles ached, and his hands grew raw from the constant handling of rough materials. But what struck him most wasn't the physical labor, it was the atmosphere. The workers around him moved in silence, their faces blank, their eyes tired. There was no laughter, no camaraderie, just the relentless grind of the job. During his lunch break, he sat alone at a corner table, observing the others. The man he had seen the previous night was there, sitting by himself, eating a small sandwich from a brown paper bag. The CEO wanted to approach him, to ask him why he had been digging through the trash, but he held back. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, not yet. Instead, he struck up a conversation with another worker, a younger man who looked barely out of his teens. The young man was friendly but guarded, speaking in short sentences. When the CEO asked him how long he had been working there, the young man shrugged. "A few months," he said. "It's not great, but it's a job, you know? Gotta pay the bills." The CEO nodded, but inside, he felt a pang of guilt. This young man, barely an adult, was already resigned to a life of monotony and exhaustion. And for what? A paycheck that barely covered the basics? The CEO thought about his own children, about the opportunities they had, and felt a sharp contrast to the lives of these workers. As the days went by, the CEO continued to work alongside his employees, listening to their conversations and observing their routines. He learned about their struggles, the single mothers working double shifts, the older workers with chronic pain, the young ones dreaming of a better life but trapped in a cycle of debt. Each story weighed heavily on him, and he began to see his company in a new light. But the hardest part was watching the man who had been sneaking food. The CEO learned his name, let's call him John, and saw how hard he worked, how dedicated he was despite his circumstances. John never complained, never asked for help. He just kept going, day after day, doing what he had to do to survive. The CEO knew he couldn't stay undercover forever. Sooner or later, he would have to reveal himself and confront the realities he had uncovered. But for now, he kept his head down and continued to work, determined to understand the full extent of the problem before taking action. The days turned into weeks, and the CEO found himself settling into the rhythm of warehouse life. He woke up early, worked long hours, and went home exhausted, just like the rest of the workers. But unlike them, he had the luxury of returning to a comfortable home and a life of privilege. That contrast gnawed at him, making it harder to ignore the growing sense of responsibility he felt. One afternoon, during a rare moment of downtime, the CEO found himself standing next to John, the man he had seen sneaking food from the trash. They were both leaning against a stack of pallets, catching their breath after hours of heavy lifting. The CEO hesitated for a moment, then decided to break the silence. "Long day, huh?" he said, keeping his tone casual. John glanced at him, his eyes tired but kind. "Yeah, every day's a long day here," he replied with a faint smile. "You get used to it after a while." The CEO nodded, unsure of how to continue. He wanted to ask John about his life, about why he had been digging through the trash that night, but he didn't want to pry. Instead, he decided to take a different approach. "I've been here a few weeks now," the CEO said. "It's tough work, but I guess it pays the bills." John chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Barely," he said. "I've been here for 5 years, and I'm still living paycheck to paycheck. It's not easy, especially when you've got kids to feed." The CEO's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it directly from John made it all the more real. "Kids?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, 2 of them," John said, his expression softening. "A boy and a girl. They're my world. I work 2 jobs, just to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. But some months are harder than others." The CEO felt a lump in his throat. He thought about his own children, about the private schools, the vacations, the endless opportunities they had. And here was John, working himself to the bone, just to provide the basics for his kids. The injustice of it all was almost too much to bear. "I'm sorry," the CEO said quietly. "That sounds really tough." John shrugged, as if he had accepted his lot in life. "It is what it is," he said. "You do what you have to do, right? I just keep telling myself that one day, things will get better. Maybe not for me, but for my kids. That's what keeps me going." The CEO didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell John that things would get better, that he deserved more than this, but the words felt hollow. How could he promise something he wasn't sure he could deliver? As the days went by, the CEO found himself drawn to John. He admired the man's resilience, his quiet strength, and his unwavering dedication to his family. But he also felt a growing sense of guilt. This was one of his employees, someone who had helped build his company, and yet John was struggling to survive. How many others were in the same situation? How many others were sacrificing everything just to get by? The CEO began to pay closer attention to the other workers, listening to their stories and observing their struggles. He learned about Maria, a single mother who worked the night shift so she could be home with her kids during the day. He met Tom, an older man with a bad back who still showed up every day because he couldn't afford to retire. And then there was Sarah, a young woman who dreamed of going to college but was stuck in the warehouse to pay off her student loans. Each story was a reminder of the human cost of his company's success. The CEO had always prided himself on being a good businessman, but now he was starting to wonder if he had been a good person. Had he been so focused on profits and growth that he had lost sight of the people who made it all possible? One evening, as he was leaving the warehouse, the CEO saw John sitting alone in the break room, staring at a photograph. Curious, he walked over and sat down across from him. "Everything okay?" the CEO asked. John looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He held up the photograph, a picture of his two children, smiling brightly. "They're the reason I do this," he said softly. "But sometimes I wonder if it's enough. If I'm enough." The CEO felt his own eyes well up. He reached out and placed a hand on John's shoulder. "You're more than enough," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a good man, and a great father. Don't ever doubt that." John nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. The CEO sat with him for a while, neither of them speaking, just sharing the weight of the moment. It was then that the CEO realized he couldn't stay silent any longer. He had to do something, not just for John, but for all the workers who were struggling in silence. But what could he do? Revealing his identity would risk everything, but staying silent felt like a betrayal. The CEO knew he was at a crossroads, and the decision he made next would change not only his life but the lives of everyone around him. The CEO left the warehouse that night with a heavy heart. John's words echoed in his mind, along with the faces of the other workers he had come to know. He couldn't shake the image of John sitting alone in the break room, holding that photograph of his children. It was a stark reminder of the sacrifices people made just to survive, and it made the CEO question everything he thought he knew about his company. As he drove home, he replayed the conversations he'd had with the workers. Maria, the single mother, had told him about how she often skipped meals to make sure her kids had enough to eat. Tom, the older man with the bad back, had shared how he couldn't afford the medication he needed because his insurance didn't cover it. And Sarah, the young woman with dreams of college, had confided in him about how she felt trapped in a cycle of debt and exhaustion. The CEO had always believed that his company was doing well by its employees. He had implemented policies that he thought were fair, competitive wages, benefits, and opportunities for advancement. But now, seeing the reality of their lives, he realized how far short those policies fell. The workers weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were people with dreams, struggles, and families who depended on them. And they deserved better. That night, the CEO couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about his own journey, how he had started the company with nothing but a vision and a lot of hard work. He had always believed that success was about making the right decisions, about being tough and focused. But now, he wondered if he had lost something along the way, his humanity. The next morning, he returned to the warehouse, determined to dig deeper. He wanted to understand not just the struggles of the workers, but also the systems and policies that had failed them. He started by observing the supervisors and managers, watching how they interacted with the employees. What he saw disturbed him. One supervisor, in particular, stood out. He was a tall, imposing man with a loud voice and a harsh demeanor. The CEO watched as he berated a worker for taking too long on a task, his tone dripping with contempt. The worker, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, apologized profusely, his face red with embarrassment. The supervisor didn't seem to care, he just walked away, leaving the young man to finish his work in silence. The CEO felt a surge of anger. This wasn't leadership, it was bullying. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next few days, he saw similar behavior from other supervisors, workers being yelled at, humiliated, and treated like machines rather than human beings. It was no wonder the atmosphere in the warehouse was so tense and joyless. But the CEO also noticed something else, something that gave him hope. Despite the harsh treatment, the workers supported each other. They shared food during breaks, covered for each other when someone was struggling, and offered words of encouragement when things got tough. It was a quiet kind of resilience, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. One day, during lunch, the CEO sat with a group of workers, including John. They were talking about their dreams, what they would do if they didn't have to worry about money or bills. Maria said she wanted to go back to school and become a teacher. Tom said he wanted to retire and spend time with his grandchildren. Sarah said she wanted to travel the world and write a book. And John? He just smiled and said, "I just want my kids to have a better life than I did." The CEO listened quietly, his heart aching. These weren't extravagant dreams, they were simple, heartfelt desires. And yet, for these workers, they felt out of reach. The CEO realized then that he had the power to change that, to give these people a chance at a better life. But it wouldn't be easy. It would mean challenging the very systems he had put in place, systems that prioritized profits over people. That evening, as he left the warehouse, the CEO made a decision. He couldn't stay undercover any longer. He had seen enough, heard enough, and felt enough to know what needed to be done. But revealing his identity would come with risks. The workers might feel betrayed, the management might resist, and the company's bottom line might take a hit. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was doing the right thing. The next morning, the CEO arrived at the warehouse early, his heart pounding with anticipation. He gathered the workers in the break room, his hands trembling slightly as he stood before them. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "I need to tell you all something," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I haven't been completely honest with you. My name isn't what you think it is. I'm not just a temporary worker. I'm the CEO of this company." There was a stunned silence as the workers processed his words. The CEO could see the shock and confusion on their faces, and he knew he had a lot of explaining to do. But he also knew that this was just the beginning, the first step toward making things right. The break room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. The workers stared at the CEO, their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and confusion. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, John broke the silence. "You're the CEO?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of emotions. "You've been working here, alongside us, all this time? Why?" The CEO took a deep breath, knowing he had to choose his words carefully. "I came here because I wanted to understand," he said. "I wanted to see what life was really like for the people who make this company run. And what I've seen, it's changed me." Maria crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "So, what? You've been spying on us? Playing some kind of game?" "No," the CEO said quickly, shaking his head. "It wasn't a game. I didn't come here to spy. I came here to learn. And what I've learned is that I've failed you. All of you." The room fell silent again as the workers exchanged glances. The CEO could see the skepticism in their eyes, and he didn't blame them. He had lied to them, after all. But he also saw something else, a flicker of hope. They were listening, and that was all he could ask for. "I've seen the struggles you face every day," he continued. "I've seen the sacrifices you make, the way you support each other, and the way you keep going even when it feels impossible. And I've seen how this company, my company, has let you down. That's on me. And I'm here to make it right." Tom, the older worker with the bad back, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "How?" he asked. "How are you going to make it right? Words are easy. Actions are harder." The CEO nodded. "You're right," he said. "Words don't mean much unless they're backed up by action. And that's why I'm not just here to apologize. I'm here to make changes, real changes. Starting today." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of the people who had trusted him, even if they didn't know who he really was. "First," he said, "I'm raising wages. Effective immediately, everyone in this warehouse will receive a significant pay increase. No one who works for this company should have to struggle to put food on the table." There was a murmur of surprise, but no one interrupted. The CEO went on. Second, we're overhauling the benefits package. That includes better healthcare, paid time off, and support for those who want to further their education or training. And third, we're going to address the way supervisors and managers treat employees. Bullying and disrespect will not be tolerated. Ever. The workers exchanged glances again, this time with a hint of cautious optimism. John spoke up, his voice quieter now. And what about the people who've already been treated badly? What about the ones who've been pushed to their limits? The CEO met his gaze, his expression solemn. We're going to make it right, he said. We're going to listen to your concerns, address your grievances, and do everything we can to make sure this company is a place where people feel valued and respected. There was another pause as the workers absorbed his words. Then, slowly, Maria stood up. I want to believe you, she said. But how do we know this isn't just another empty promise? How do we know you're not just saying what we want to hear? The CEO nodded, understanding her skepticism. You don't, he said honestly. And I don't expect you to trust me right away. Trust has to be earned. All I can do is show you, through my actions, that I mean what I say. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that to you. The room was quiet again, but the tension had shifted. The workers were still wary, but there was a sense of cautious hope in the air. The CEO knew he had a long way to go to earn their trust, but he was determined to see it through. Over the next few days, the CEO kept his word. He held meetings with the workers, listening to their concerns and ideas. He met with the supervisors and managers, making it clear that disrespectful behavior would no longer be tolerated. And he worked with the HR department to implement the changes he had promised, from wage increases to improved benefits. But the real test came when he had to face the board of directors. The CEO knew that not everyone would support his decisions. Some would argue that the changes were too costly, that they would hurt the company's bottom line. But he was ready to fight for what he believed was right. At the board meeting, the CEO stood before the directors, his voice steady but firm. I know. Some of you may not agree with these changes, he said. But I've seen firsthand what our employees go through. And I believe that investing in them is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Happy, well-treated employees are more productive, more loyal, and more likely to help this company succeed in the long run. There was some pushback, as he had expected. But the CEO stood his ground, arguing passionately for the changes he had promised. In the end, the board agreed to give him a chance to prove that his approach would work. Back at the warehouse, the workers began to notice the changes. The pay increases made a real difference, allowing them to breathe a little easier. The new benefits gave them hope for a better future. And the shift in management style created a more positive, supportive work environment. But the CEO knew that the most important change was the one that couldn't be measured in dollars or policies. It was the change in the way the workers looked at him, not as a distant, untouchable figure, but as someone who cared about their well-being. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. One evening, as the CEO was leaving the warehouse, he saw John sitting alone in the break room again. This time, he wasn't staring at a photograph. He was smiling, his face relaxed in a way the CEO hadn't seen before. The CEO walked over and sat down across from him. "How are you doing?" he asked. John looked up, his smile widening. "Better," he said. "A lot better. Thanks to you." The CEO shook his head. "Not thanks to me," he said. "Thanks to you. You're the one who opened my eyes. You're the one who made me see what really matters." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I wasn't sure about you at first. But I think you're the real deal. And I think this company is going to be a better place because of you." The CEO felt a lump in his throat. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so." The changes at the warehouse didn't happen overnight, but they were noticeable. The workers began to smile more, to laugh during breaks, and to share stories about how the pay raises and improved benefits were making a difference in their lives. Maria was able to cut back on her second job and spend more time with her kids. Tom finally got the medication he needed for his back. And Sarah started taking online classes, inching closer to her dream of going to college. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Some of the supervisors, particularly the ones who had been harsh and authoritarian, resisted the new policies. They grumbled about coddling the workers and complained that productivity would suffer. The CEO knew he had to address this head-on. One afternoon, he called a meeting with all the supervisors. He stood at the front of the room, his expression serious but calm. "I know some of you are skeptical about the changes we're making," he began. "But I want to be clear, this isn't about coddling anyone. It's about treating people with respect and dignity. And it's about creating a workplace where everyone can thrive." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've seen the way some of you interact with the workers," he continued. "And I've seen the impact it has, not just on morale, but on productivity. When people feel valued, they work harder. When they feel respected, they're more loyal. And when they're treated fairly, they're more likely to go above and beyond for this company." One of the supervisors, a man named Greg, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "With all due respect," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "this isn't a charity. We're here to get the job done, not to hold hands and sing songs." The CEO's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "This isn't about charity," he said. "It's about good business. And if you can't see that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." The room fell silent. Greg's face turned red, but he didn't say anything else. The CEO looked around the room, making eye contact with each of the supervisors. "I'm not asking you to agree with me," he said. "I'm asking you to trust me. And I'm asking you to give this a chance. If it doesn't work, we'll revisit it. But if it does, and I believe it will, it's going to make this company stronger than ever." After the meeting, the CEO felt a mix of emotions. He knew he had made some enemies, but he also knew he had done the right thing. Change was never easy, especially for those who benefited from the status quo. But he was determined to see it through. Over the next few weeks, the CEO continued to visit the warehouse regularly, not as an undercover worker but as himself. He made a point of talking to the employees, listening to their feedback, and addressing their concerns. He also kept a close eye on the supervisors, making sure they were adhering to the new policies. One day, as he was walking through the warehouse, he noticed Greg talking to a group of workers. His tone was still harsh, his words still critical. The CEO felt a surge of frustration, but he knew he had to handle the situation carefully. He approached Greg and waited until the workers had moved on before speaking. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Greg turned to him, his expression defiant. "What about?" "About the way you're treating the workers," the CEO said. "I thought I made it clear that disrespectful behavior won't be tolerated." Greg shrugged. "I'm just doing my job," he said. "If they can't handle a little criticism, maybe they shouldn't be here." The CEO took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. "Your job isn't to criticize," he said. "Your job is to lead. And leadership isn't about tearing people down, it's about building them up." Greg rolled his eyes. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one dealing with lazy workers and missed deadlines." The CEO's patience snapped. "If the workers are lazy, it's because they're not being motivated. If deadlines are being missed, it's because they're not being supported. And that's on you." Greg's face turned red again, but this time, he didn't have a comeback. The CEO took a step closer, his voice steady but intense. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said. "But if I see or hear about you treating the workers with anything less than respect, you're out. Do you understand?" Greg nodded, though his expression was still defiant. The CEO didn't trust him, but he hoped the warning would be enough. As the weeks went by, the CEO began to see the impact of the changes. Productivity didn't suffer, it improved. The workers were more engaged, more motivated, and more willing to go the extra mile. And the atmosphere in the warehouse shifted from one of tension and exhaustion to one of collaboration and camaraderie. But the real test came one evening, when the CEO received a call from the night shift supervisor. There had been an accident, a forklift had tipped over, and one of the workers was injured. The CEO's heart sank as he rushed to the warehouse. When he arrived, he found the workers gathered around the injured man, who was sitting on the floor with a bandage on his arm. The supervisor was on the phone with emergency services, and the CEO could hear the concern in his voice. The CEO knelt beside the injured worker, a young man named Alex. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. Alex nodded, though his face was pale. "I think so," he said. "It's just my arm. It hurts, but I don't think it's broken." The CEO placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're going to be fine," he said. "We're going to take care of you." As they waited for the ambulance, the CEO looked around at the workers. They were worried, but they were also calm and focused, working together to make sure Alex was comfortable. It was a stark contrast to the tense, fearful atmosphere he had seen when he first came to the warehouse. When the ambulance arrived, the CEO rode with Alex to the hospital. He stayed with him until he was treated and released, making sure he had everything he needed. And as he drove Alex home, he felt a sense of pride, not just in the company, but in the people who made it what it was. The accident with Alex was a wake-up call for the CEO. It reminded him that no matter how much progress they made, there was always more to do. Safety had always been a priority on paper, but now he saw the gaps in their policies and the risks the workers faced every day. He knew he had to take action, not just to prevent future accidents, but to show the workers that their well-being truly mattered. The next morning, the CEO called an emergency meeting with the warehouse managers and supervisors. He didn't mince words. "What happened last night was unacceptable," he said, his voice firm. "We're lucky it wasn't worse. But luck isn't a strategy. We need to do better, for Alex, for everyone who works here, and for this company." He outlined a plan to overhaul the safety protocols, from better training for equipment operators to regular inspections of machinery. He also announced the creation of a safety committee, made up of workers and managers, to identify risks and propose solutions. "This isn't just about following rules," he said. "It's about creating a culture where safety comes first. And that starts with all of us." The response was mixed. Some of the managers nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. Greg, the supervisor who had been resistant to change, rolled his eyes. "More paperwork," he muttered under his breath. "Just what we need." The CEO ignored the comment, but he made a mental note to keep an eye on Greg. He couldn't afford to have anyone undermining the changes they were trying to make. Over the next few weeks, the CEO threw himself into the safety initiative. He attended training sessions, participated in inspections, and met regularly with the safety committee. He also made a point of checking in with Alex, who had returned to work with his arm in a sling. The young man was grateful for the support, but he also had some ideas for improving safety. "It's not just about the equipment," Alex said during one of their conversations. "It's about the way we work. Sometimes we're so focused on meeting deadlines that we cut corners. We need to slow down and do things right." The CEO nodded, impressed by Alex's insight. "You're absolutely right," he said. "And that's something we need to address. No deadline is worth risking someone's safety." As the safety improvements took effect, the CEO began to see a shift in the warehouse. The workers were more cautious, more aware of their surroundings, and more willing to speak up if they saw something unsafe. The atmosphere felt calmer, more controlled, and the CEO felt a sense of pride in what they were building together. But not everyone was on board. Greg continued to resist the changes, and his attitude was starting to affect the workers under his supervision. The CEO knew he had to address the issue, but he wanted to give Greg one last chance to turn things around. One afternoon, he called Greg into his office. The supervisor sat down, his arms crossed and his expression defiant. "What's this about?" he asked. The CEO leaned forward, his tone serious, but calm. "I've been hearing some concerns about your team," he said. "They say you're pushing them too hard, ignoring safety protocols, and creating a hostile work environment. Is that true?" Greg shrugged. "I'm just doing my job," he said. "If they can't handle the pressure, maybe they shouldn't be here." The CEO's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Your job isn't to pressure people," he said. "Your job is to lead. And leadership isn't about pushing people to their limits, it's about helping them succeed." Greg rolled his eyes. "You're soft," he said. "That's why this company is going downhill." The CEO felt a surge of anger, but he didn't let it show. "This company isn't going downhill," he said. "It's changing. And if you can't adapt to those changes, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." Greg's face turned red, but he didn't say anything. The CEO leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said. "But if I hear one more complaint about your behavior, you're out. Do you understand?" Greg nodded, though his expression was still defiant. The CEO didn't trust him, but he hoped the warning would be enough. As the weeks went by, the CEO continued to focus on building a better workplace. He held regular meetings with the workers, listening to their feedback and addressing their concerns. He also worked closely with the safety committee, implementing their recommendations and celebrating their successes. But the real test came one evening, when the CEO received a call from the night shift supervisor. There had been another accident. This time, a pallet had fallen from a high shelf, narrowly missing a worker. The CEO's heart sank as he rushed to the warehouse. When he arrived, he found the workers gathered around the supervisor, who was explaining what had happened. The worker who had been nearly hit was shaken, but unharmed. The CEO felt a surge of relief, but he also felt a sense of frustration. They had come so far, but there was still more to do. He called another emergency meeting, this time with the entire warehouse staff. He stood at the front of the room, his expression serious, but calm. "What happened tonight was a reminder that we can't let our guard down," he said. "Safety isn't something we can take for granted. It's something we have to work on every single day." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of the people who had trusted him, who had believed in the changes he was trying to make. "I know this isn't easy," he said. "Change never is. But I also know that we're stronger when we work together. And I believe that we can build a workplace where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected." The workers nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and hope. The CEO felt a lump in his throat as he realized how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. The near-miss accident with the falling pallet was a turning point for the warehouse. The workers, already invested in the changes the CEO had initiated, became even more vigilant about safety. They started reporting potential hazards proactively, and the safety committee worked tirelessly to address them. The CEO felt a sense of pride in how far they had come, but he also knew they couldn't become complacent. Safety wasn't a one-time fix, it was an ongoing commitment. One of the most significant changes came from the workers themselves. They proposed a buddy system, where each employee would pair up with a coworker to watch out for each other during shifts. The idea was simple but effective, and the CEO immediately approved it. He was amazed by how much the workers had taken ownership of the safety initiative. It wasn't just his project anymore, it was theirs. But not everyone was on board. Greg, the resistant supervisor, continued to undermine the changes. He mocked the buddy system, calling it childish, and pressured his team to work faster, even if it meant cutting corners. The CEO had hoped his warning would be enough to change Greg's behavior, but it was clear now that it wasn't. One afternoon, the CEO received a report from one of the workers on Greg's team. The worker, a young woman named Lisa, had overheard Greg telling his team to ignore the new safety protocols to meet a deadline. She was afraid to speak up directly, but had confided in the safety committee. The CEO knew he couldn't ignore this. Greg's behavior wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. The CEO called Greg into his office again. This time, he didn't mince words. "I've given you multiple chances to change," he said, his voice firm. "But it's clear that you're not willing to adapt. Your actions are putting people at risk, and that's something I can't tolerate." Greg crossed his arms, his expression defiant. "You're overreacting," he said. "I'm just trying to get the job done. If people can't handle it, that's their problem." The CEO shook his head. "No, Greg. It's not their problem, it's yours. And it's mine, because I'm responsible for everyone in this warehouse. And I can't let you keep putting people in danger." Greg's face turned red, but he didn't say anything. The CEO took a deep breath, his tone calm but final. "I'm letting you go," he said. "Effective immediately. This isn't personal, it's about keeping people safe. And that's non-negotiable." Greg stared at him for a moment, then stood up and walked out without another word. The CEO felt a mix of emotions, relief that he had taken action, but also sadness that it had come to this. He knew firing Greg would send a strong message, but he also hoped it would show the workers that their safety truly mattered. The next day, the CEO held a meeting with the entire warehouse staff. He didn't mention Greg by name, but he made it clear that anyone who disregarded safety protocols would face consequences. "This isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about accountability. We're all responsible for each other, and we all have to do our part to keep this workplace safe." The workers nodded, their expressions serious but supportive. The CEO could see the relief in their eyes. Relief that someone was finally standing up for them. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. As the weeks went by, the warehouse continued to improve. The workers were more engaged, more motivated, and more invested in the company's success. The CEO made a point of recognizing their efforts, whether it was through bonuses, public praise, or simple gestures like bringing in lunch for the entire team. He wanted them to know that their hard work didn't go unnoticed. But the real test came one evening, when the CEO received a call from the night shift supervisor. There had been a fire in one of the storage areas. The CEO's heart raced as he rushed to the warehouse, his mind filled with worst-case scenarios. When he arrived, he found the workers gathered outside, safe but shaken. The fire had been small and contained quickly, thanks to the new safety protocols and the quick thinking of the workers. The CEO felt a surge of relief as he realized how much worse it could have been. He walked over to the group, his expression calm but concerned. "Is everyone okay?" he asked. The workers nodded, their faces pale but relieved. One of them, a man named Carlos, stepped forward. "We're fine," he said. "But it was close. If we hadn't had the new fire extinguishers and the training, it could have been a lot worse." The CEO felt a lump in his throat. "I'm just glad everyone's safe," he said. "You all did an amazing job." As the workers began to clean up and assess the damage, the CEO stayed behind to talk to Carlos. "What happened?" he asked. Carlos explained that the fire had started in a pile of cardboard boxes that had been left too close to a heating vent. "We've been telling management about that for weeks," he said. But nothing was done. The CEO's heart sank. He had thought they were making progress, but this was a reminder that there were still gaps in their system. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have listened sooner. But I promise you, this won't happen again." The next day, the CEO held another emergency meeting. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. "Last night was a wake-up call," he said. "We've come a long way, but we still have work to do. And we can't do it without your help. If you see something that's not right, speak up. Don't wait for someone else to do it. We're all in this together." The workers nodded, their expressions determined. The CEO felt a surge of pride as he realized how much they had grown as a team. They weren't just employees, they were partners in building a better workplace. The fire incident was a sobering reminder of how much work still needed to be done, but it also solidified the CEO's resolve. He knew that creating a safe, supportive workplace wasn't a one-time effort, it was an ongoing journey. And he was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. In the weeks that followed, the CEO doubled down on his commitment to the workers. He held regular town hall meetings, where employees could voice their concerns and share their ideas. He implemented a new system for reporting hazards, ensuring that every concern was addressed promptly. And he continued to invest in training and equipment, making safety a top priority. But the most significant change came from the workers themselves. They had taken ownership of the safety initiative, treating it not as a set of rules imposed from above, but as a shared responsibility. They looked out for each other, celebrated each other's successes, and held each other accountable. The warehouse, once a place of tension and exhaustion, had become a community. One afternoon, the CEO was walking through the warehouse when he noticed John, the man he had first seen sneaking food from the trash, talking to a group of new hires. John was explaining the buddy system, his voice confident and his demeanor calm. The CEO stopped to listen, a smile spreading across his face. "It's not just about following rules," John was saying. "It's about looking out for each other. We're a team here, and we've got each other's backs." The CEO felt a lump in his throat as he realized how far John had come. This was the same man who had once been so desperate that he resorted to scavenging for food. Now, he was a leader, someone who inspired and guided others. It was a testament to the power of compassion and the impact of giving people a chance to thrive. The CEO approached John after the talk. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with pride. John smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. "We all have," he said. "Thanks to you." The CEO shook his head. "Not thanks to me," he said. "Thanks to you. You're the one who opened my eyes. You're the one who made me see what really matters." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I wasn't sure about you at first. But I think you're the real deal. And I think this company is going to be a better place because of you." The CEO felt a surge of emotion. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so." As the months went by, the changes at the warehouse began to ripple outward. Other branches of the company took notice, and soon the CEO was implementing similar initiatives across the organization. He shared the story of the warehouse with his board of directors, using it as proof that investing in people wasn't just the right thing to do, it was good business. The company's profits didn't suffer, in fact, they grew. The workers were more productive, more loyal, and more motivated. And the CEO knew why. It wasn't because of the pay raises or the benefits, though those certainly helped. It was because the workers felt valued. They knew that their voices mattered, that their well-being was a priority, and that they were part of something bigger than themselves. One evening, as the CEO was leaving the warehouse, he stopped to look around. The workers were finishing their shifts, laughing and chatting as they headed home. The atmosphere was light, joyful, and full of hope. It was a far cry from the tense, joyless place he had first encountered. The CEO felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he realized how much they had accomplished together. But he also knew that their work wasn't done. There would always be challenges, always room for improvement. And that was okay. Because they were in it together. As he drove home, the CEO reflected on the journey he had been on. He had started as a man who valued profits above all else, who saw his employees as numbers on a spreadsheet. But now, he saw them as people with dreams, struggles, and families who depended on them. And he knew that his success wasn't measured in dollars and cents. It was measured in the lives he had touched, the people he had helped, and the legacy he was building. The CEO's story spread beyond the company, inspiring other business leaders to rethink their priorities. He became a vocal advocate for fair wages, safe working conditions, and compassionate leadership. And though he faced criticism from some who accused him of being soft, he didn't let it deter him. He knew the truth, that true success wasn't about being tough. It was about being human. Years later, as the CEO stood on stage at a conference, sharing his story with a room full of business leaders, he felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. "It's not about the bottom line," he said. It's about the people. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who make everything possible. And if we take care of them, they'll take care of us. The audience erupted into applause, but the CEO's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about John, Maria, Tom, Sarah, and all the other workers who had trusted him, who had believed in the changes he was trying to make. They were the real heroes of this story. And he would be forever grateful for the lessons they had taught him. As he left the stage, the CEO felt a sense of peace. He had started this journey to understand his company, but he had ended up understanding himself. And he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with humility, compassion, and a commitment to doing what was right. The end.